So, President Trump's recent State of the Union? It was a record breaker for length, that's for sure. But was it a record breaker for accuracy? In this explainer, we're not just going to run through the claims one by one. We're going to give you a framework, a new way to listen to any political speech, so you can start separating the facts from the spin all on your own.
Think about it. The State of the Union is basically a fire hose of information coming right at you. It's a long, really dense speech, and it's designed to persuade millions of people at once. So the big question for anyone watching is, how are you supposed to make sense of all that? How do you figure out what's a real, core fact, what's just political spin, and what needs a much closer look?
Okay, first things first. Let's just wrap our heads around the scale here. This speech clocked in at 1 hour and 48 minutes. I mean, that's longer than a lot of movies you'd go see in a theater. For almost 2 hours straight, the president was laying out his agenda in front of what was probably his biggest TV audience before the midterm elections.
So, what was the big takeaway message? Well, it was all about strength. The president painted this picture of a booming economy, calling it a turnaround for the ages. He was pointing to things like falling gas prices and a soaring stock market as hard proof that his administration's policies were working for everyday Americans.
And, as you'd probably guess, the minute the speech was over, it was seen through two totally different lenses. You had Democrats, like Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger, saying it was a complete disconnect from reality, and then you had Republicans, like Vice President J.D. Vance, saying, see, he's delivering on his promises. And right there, that's the first layer of spin we gotta peel back.
Democrats really zeroed in on one thing: affordability. I mean, you heard Representative Ted Lieu put it pretty bluntly. He said there's a huge gap between the rosy picture the president painted and what people are actually seeing in their bank accounts. Their argument was that the speech was totally out of touch with the financial pressures that a lot of families are dealing with right now.
Right, so we've got these two completely different stories. How do we figure out what's real? Well, that's where the numbers come in. So let's do it. Let's dig into a few of the biggest claims from the speech and see how they actually stack up against the data.
Let's start with something we all feel: gas prices. The president claimed they were below $2.30 in most states. But if you look at the data from AAA, while prices have definitely fallen, which is great, no state actually had an average that low. So the trend he's pointing to, that part's right. But the specific number? Yeah, that was a bit of a stretch.
All right, next up. This one sounds like a huge win, right? The administration says they lifted 2.4 million people off of food stamps. On the surface, that sounds like a massive success story for the economy, a sign that things are really turning around for a lot of people.
But with this one, the context is everything. The number of people on SNAP benefits or food stamps did go down, that's true. But that 2.4 million number, it seems to come from a Congressional Budget Office projection of how many people would lose their benefits because of new work requirements. So the drop happened, yeah, but the reason why seems to be more about a change in the rules than it is about millions of people suddenly getting better paying jobs. Okay, let's talk about another big claim from the speech: voter fraud. The president called it rampant. That's a really serious charge, so what do the numbers actually say?
Well, after the 2024 election, the Department of Homeland Security actually dug into this. They looked at almost 50 million voter registrations, and what they found was this: only 0.02% were flagged for possibly not being citizens. That is a tiny, tiny fraction.
And it's not just them. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative group that tracks these things, looked at cases over a 20-year period. 20 years! And nationwide, they found only 85 cases of non-citizens voting that were actually prosecuted. Let's bring it down to the state level. In Georgia, after a massive audit in 2024, they found just 20 non-citizens registered to vote, out of more than 8.2 million voters. So the data, no matter where you look, tells a pretty clear story here. This is not a rampant problem.
Okay, so we've just seen how a claim can sound one way, but the data can tell a totally different story with a little context. This brings us to a much bigger idea. How can you do this every day? How do you think critically about this stuff? Well, there's a really simple framework that I think helps a lot. We call it the anchor and the analyst.
All right, first up, let's talk about the anchor. The anchor's job is super simple. They just give you the basic, can't argue with it facts. They tell you what happened. So, for example, the president's speech was 1 hour and 48 minutes long. That's an anchor fact. Simple, objective, verifiable.
And then you have the analyst. The analyst is the one who tells you why any of this matters. They give you the context, the bigger picture. So an analyst might say, the speech was that long because the president needed to address multiple key voting blocks before the midterms. You see? That's the analyst telling you the bigger story behind the fact.
You see, a really good news report needs both of them working together. It starts with the anchor giving you the headline, the what. Then the analyst comes in with the context and the meaning, the why. The what is just information, but the why, that's where understanding comes from. And your job, when you're watching, is to spot when you're only getting one without the other.
Okay, so let's put this all together into a toolkit for you. When you're watching the news, try to actively separate these two roles. First, listen for the anchor. What are the simple, hard facts here? Then, try to identify the analyst. What's the layer of interpretation or context I'm being given? Just ask yourself two simple questions. What happened, and why does this matter? Learning to separate the what from the why is the whole game.
Look, this framework is super simple, but it's also really powerful. It helps you go from just, passively watching the news to actually analyzing it. So the next time you turn on the news, don't just be a viewer, be a detective. Can you spot the anchor? Can you spot the analyst? And maybe even more importantly, can you tell when the analyst might be trying to sell you a story instead of just giving you the facts?